So just before I sort of get into the meat of things in terms of the Kelmscott Press and William Morris, just a little bit of an overview of Norfolk Heritage Centre, very, very briefly. I won't speak about this too much, but as Rachel said, my name is Chris Tracy, and I'm the Archive Specialist based at Norfolk Heritage Centre on the second floor of the Norfolk and Norwich Millennium Library. As Rachel says, I work very closely with her there, doing educational outreach activities, school visits, and so on, helping people with their inquiries and what have you. But I'm actually technically employed by Norfolk Record Office. And so we're kind of like the sister site, effectively, to Norfolk Record Office. And the distinction, fundamentally, although there are one or two overlaps, is that we at Norfolk Heritage Centre hold published printed material to do with the history of Norfolk. Okay, so whereas Norfolk Record Office, which is based in the Archive Centre and encompasses, the Archive Centre includes Norfolk Record Office, Norfolk Sound Archive and the East Anglian Film Archive, and it's based at the other side of the city, on the outskirts of the city next to County Hall. They hold their 12 million original archives to do with the history of the county. So things like wills, parish registers and letters and diaries and business records, all of these things generated over hundreds and hundreds of years, going right back to the medieval period, generated by individuals and organisations to do with the county. Whereas, as I say, Norfolk Heritage Centre holds printed, i.e. published material. So obviously local studies books, we've got thousands and thousands of those, but things like trade directories, maps, photographs, prints, newspapers, sales catalogues, and lots of ephemera as well, some of which actually you'll see later on this evening. But we also hold in the Heritage Centre, that's the inquiry desk there, and that's our stack. In the search room area, we also hold many metal cabinets stuffed to the gills with microfilm and microfiche duplicates of records which are histories and things which are quite often a sort of thing as well. Okay, so that done with, we'll get straight into to William Morris, and just this is, as you can see, this is a picture of our store, and just a sort of an insight into the genesis of this talk. As it has been for everyone, this year has been very difficult for all of us working in the library, and of course everyone across the country with the restrictions and the effects of COVID and what have you. And overnight, literally overnight in March last year, obviously we had to close the library, and all our events could no longer take place, and had to cancel school visits and all the rest of it, which was terrible, obviously, and we had to learn to adapt pretty quickly. But what it did do was give us a moment or two to sort of, in a way, step back a little bit and just to actually, move off the constant treadmill of, not treadmill, makes it sound terrible, but, the constant conveyor belt of, the usual events and inquiries and all that sort of thing, and actually investigate our collections a bit more closely. And I've been aware, in a fairly vague and general way, I was aware of William Morris and what a huge titanic figure he was, but not in a huge amount of detail. And I was aware that we had a collection of Kelmscott Press books lurking in our store, which I saw from time to time when I was going out to retrieve other things. So the last 14, 15 months has been an opportunity to look a bit more closely at elements of our collections, including the Kelmscott Press books, and to do a little bit more research about them, to learn more about them, and truly discover what these marvelous things are, to the extent that I thought it was would be helpful to try and impart a little bit of that. I'll say enthusiasm rather than knowledge. I mean, I have obviously researched this talk, but I in no way would describe myself as an expert on Kelmscott Press. However, I am very, very interested in enthusiasm. They are marvelous, magnificent books, beautiful, astonishing things to, I'm really, really privileged to be able to, just pop into the stack sort of now and again and have a look at them. And I just, really the aim of this session is just to show you what we have. And I really do hope that, come July the 19th and beyond, and we are again once able to do in-person events, that we will be able to put on some kind of event in person that really shows these books off, and that you and others are able to come and look at these books in person. Okay, so first of all, then, I'm sure many of you, are familiar with William Morris, but who was William Morris? We need to start with that, really, don't we? He was born on 24th of March 1834, died in 1896, and as many of you will be aware, he was an astonishing figure, incredibly prolific across a multitude of different artistic fields, not only artistic either, but he was a designer. First and foremost, he was a designer of wonderful furnishings, encompassing furniture, fabric, wallpaper, stained glass. He was a successful businessman, of course, and founded Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Co. Described themselves as fine art workmen in painting, carving, furniture and the metals. Later, of course, went on to become Morris and Co., which carried on into the 20th century and through various manifestations, obviously, of course, also exists today. A really, really good quality writer, of course, as well. He was a poet, novelist, political pamphleteer, propagandist. I think it's important to stress, he didn't just do all this stuff. I mean, he was a polymath. He was incredibly gifted across many different fields, as I say. But he actually did all these things, annoyingly, to an incredibly high standard. He, in terms of a poet, he was touted as being the successor to Alfred Lord Tennyson when Tennyson died, and the poet laureateship was vacant. He was, widely regarded as a first-rate poet and writer in the mid to late 19th century. He was, of course, also, and this infused his other works, and also the Kelmscott Press related work that he did. His politics, of course, incredibly important. He was a founder of the Socialist League in 1884, the precursor in many ways to the Labour Party of the 20th century, and is, a cornerstone figure for politicians and students of British left-wing politics. Yeah, I mean, if you're interested, obviously, I hope you are interested. You wouldn't be you would be attending tonight if you weren't. But I would heartily recommend, if you want to learn more about Morris the man, to read Fiona McCarthy's biography, because it's a superb book, and really does give you a measure of just the extent of his gifts. I'll just quote you one of the sort of quotes that Fiona McCarthy mentions in her book. She quotes one of Morris's doctors, famously saying, when Morris was on his deathbed in 1896, that his fatal illness was simply being William Morris and having done more work than most 10 men. So he was, of course, also a book lover and book collector, and practicer. Actually, I forgot to mention that in his list of accomplishments, but he was a talented calligrapher and a collector of medieval manuscripts, and this, of course, informed his decision to form the Kelmscott Press in 1888, 1889. What we've got here. So hang on, just before I elaborate on this photograph, this wonderful photograph here. So just to sort of give you an indication of how the next sort of hour and 15 minutes is going to pan out. The aims of this session then are basically threefold. So to discuss, obviously, the aims of William Morris in setting up his Kelmscott Press, and to discuss the influences and the events and the factors which led to the appearance of these magnificent books. Also, of course, you know, I hope that you will go away with an enhanced appreciation of Morris's achievement and lasting influence in the book arts. And also, and I appreciate that this is a nigh on impossible task, but as far as possible with a virtual online session, you know, I want to try and hopefully convey a little bit of a sense of the individual character of some of the Kelmscott Press books that I'm going to be showing slides of this evening. So in order to do all that, the plan is to talk you through for about sort of for the next 15 minutes or so. I'm going to show you a number of illustrations of examples of incunabula, so books printed prior to 1501 that we have in the Norfolk Heritage Centre and the Millennium Library collections, to give you a bit of an indication of the influences on the Kelmscott Press in terms of Morris's ideas about book design and his efforts to create what he regarded as the ideal book in his view. So we're going to look at a few slides of some examples of pre-1500 books in our collections and how the different elements of them that influenced Morris in his design and manufacture of the Kelmscott Press books. And then we're going to look at a series, obviously, of Kelmscott Press books that we hold in our collections, roughly in chronological order of their publication. We don't hold all of the Kelmscott Press books that were issued. I believe there are 53 individual Kelmscott titles which were produced. I think we've got about sort of 40. I should have written this down precisely, shouldn't I? I think we've got about sort of 46, 47 of them. There are one or two notable omissions, such as the copy of Shakespeare's Shakespeare sonnets that was produced, and also most disappointingly, from one perspective, the Chaucer. We don't have well, I'll come on to that with this photograph, because what we have here is a photograph which I took from our digitized online website of photographs that we hold in our collection. We hold, as I mentioned at the start of the session this evening, we hold published printed material to do with the history of Norfolk, and that encompasses photographs. We're fortunate enough to have about 200,000 photographic items in the Heritage Centre collections, and about 10%, over 10 to 15% of those, about 25,000 photographs have been digitized and are put on Picture Norfolk. So if you're interested, do have a look at the Picture Norfolk website. But as I say, this photograph here shows Mr. Francis High, as it says, in his library in 1925. And these are the books. Most of these books are the ones that we hold in our collection. According to the description on the Picture Norfolk website, the books were donated by Mr. High to Norwich Castle Museum in the 1940s, and then transferred to Norwich Central Library in 1962. So that is the sort of provenance of the books. Beyond that, it's a bit of a work in progress. Intriguingly, I suspect I'm not going to have a huge amount of time once we get back to sort of business as usual, as things start to get back to normal. But I would love to be able to investigate this a little bit more, because as you can see in the centre of this delicious pile of Kelmscott Press books that Mr. High is posing with in his library, we've got the Kelmscott Chaucer. However, as I say, the Chaucer does not appear to be in our stack. So whether or not it is sort of lurking in the depths of the Castle Museum stores in Norwich, or has long since disappeared through some dastardly or nefarious means, I don't know. But I'm certainly going to have to try and make a few inquiries, I think, and discover what happened to that Kelmscott Chaucer, if it's not indeed still in the depths of the castle somewhere. So that's kind of, as I say, that's the provenance of the collection, and this is the first. I'm going to move on to those incunabula in a moment or two, but I thought it best just to start, well, to have this earlier on before we get to those, because this is obviously the opening title page, title spread of a note. Well, the title is at the top there, you can see it. A note by William Morris on his aims in founding the Kelmscott Press. This was, ironically, we're starting with the last book printed by the press. This was published posthumously, issued in March 1898. Morris, as I said, died in October 1896, so this was published posthumously, and it's worth, if you're interested at all and you haven't done so already, it's worth reading this in full. You can, if you Google a note by William Morris on his aims in founding the Kelmscott Press, I do believe you can find copies online in various sort of places, PDFs and what have you. I think Rachel might be able to pop that into the chat or email it to you at the end of the session. But it's worth reading, but the gist is in that first page. I won't read it all, but it's worth just reading that out. I began printing books with the hope of producing some which would have a definite claim to beauty, while at the same time they should be easy to read and should not dazzle the eye or trouble the intellect of the reader by eccentricity of form in the letters. I've always been a great admirer of the calligraphy of the Middle Ages and of the earlier printing which took its place. As to the 15th century books, I had noticed that they were always beautiful by force of the mere typography, even without the added ornament with which many of them are so lavishly supplied. I won't continue to read that, but I wanted to include that just to sort of give you an indication of what Morris was hoping to achieve. Basically, the Kelmscott Press, to a certain extent, could be described as a reaction against what Morris saw as the shoddy efforts of book producers, book publishers in the mid to late 19th century. As many of you will know, Morris, the most crucial influences in his life were those sort of unknown and unnamed artists and craftsmen in the medieval period who worked away on the Gothic cathedrals and what have you. And in terms of books, he fundamentally felt that book manufacture had reached a peak around about sort of 1470, 1480, maybe just about into the 1500s, but then pretty much had gone downhill since that time to a certain extent. So in terms of the actual spur to founding the Kelmscott Press, as many of you will know, Morris attended a lecture given by the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society on 15th of November 1888, and this was a crucial moment in Morris's life. It's been much written about. I believe quite a few sort of the cultural celebrities of the age were present. Oscar Wilde was present, I understand, and wrote it up very excitedly. But basically, at this lecture given by Emery Walker, he showed some slides using the magic lantern of the time, and showed the audience in extreme close-up and enlarged examples of early printed books and the different types and examples of the work of the different master typographers of the age. So people like Nicholas Jensen, who was printing in Venice in the 1470s. And this really excited Morris, basically. And Morris went away from the lecture. Walker was someone that he'd got to know already through their shared cultural interests. Emery Walker, was a slightly younger man, considerably younger, actually, about 15 odd years younger. He was born in the early 1850s, came from more of a sort of a lower middle class background than Morris, who was distinctly sort of upper middle. But Emery Walker was from a printing background. He was born in Paddington and then moved to Hammersmith in 1858. So he and Morris, both Hammersmith residents. But as I say, Walker had a printing background and set up a book illustration engraving company of his own. So he had the know-how and the knowledge and the expertise in terms of the specifics of printing and type and what have you. So in this book then, which as I say was the last printed at the Kelmscott Press, Morris outlines his tenets for the Kelmscott Press, basically, and his firm convictions, which he manifested in the Kelmscott Press books, of what he felt constituted perfect book design. And we're going to look bear with me just a moment. We're going to look at some of those with regard to, as I say, some examples of incunabula from our own collections. So the next sort of few slides, all of these books, the next sort of 4 books that I'm going to show you, come from the Norwich City Library. And just to give you a bit of background, obviously Norwich Millennium Library in the Forum is today's Norwich City Library, but the City Library collection refers specifically to about 2,000 volumes, which were collected over a couple of 200 or 300 years, but was initially founded Norwich City Library in 1608. It was one of the first libraries of its type to be established outside London. And it was created by Norwich's mayor at the time, Sir John Pettus, in collaboration with the City Assembly in Norwich, fundamentally to meet the needs of visiting clergy who would use the library as a resource for writing their sermons, and which would then be preached in the cathedral and St. Peter Mancroft Church and the many churches which Norwich had and still has, of course, in the city. So it's primarily a library which is devoted to religious works, but does have other areas such as history, dictionaries, grammars, and Bibles and what have you. But as I say, we're going to show you 1 or 2 examples of those now, just to sort of give you an indication of how they or books of that era influenced Morris. So the first one we have here is a copy of Lactantius, which is his Divine Institutes, which were an early example of a systematic presentation of Christian thought, printed in Venice, as I say, in 1797. As we saw on the previous slide, it's in a modern binding because, as I'm sure many of you we're aware, our library in Norwich, our central library, burned down in a terrible fire in the middle of the city in 1994. So quite a few of our books have been rebound since then, among them this one. But this one, as I say, printed in Venice in 1497. This isn't printed by Nicholas Jensen, but it is an example of a Venetian printed book, and the printers of Venice were particularly, of this period, 1470s, 1480s, were particularly highly regarded by Morris. As you can see, the page layout subscribes very closely to what Morris felt to be the ideal. So basically, Morris felt that the ideal unit, or the unit of the book, was the double page spread. That was an important part of his thinking about how books should be designed. So rather than the single page, Morris felt that the double page was how you needed to envisage the component parts of a book, and getting these right was paramount. And to that end, Morris outlined in the notes upon founding the Kelmscott Press how he envisaged books possessing an ideal proportion in terms of the margins, and this is exemplified here in this incunabula. So we've got here the inner margin. So if you concentrate on one side, so look at the right hand page, and if you look at the inner margin closest to the spine, that is the thinnest, the smallest margin, and then the margin increases by a proportion of approximately 20% for the upper margin at the top of the page. It again increases by a similar amount for the right hand margin, and then the lower margin is the widest, largest margin of all. And these are the proportions which Morris felt were perfected by those early printers, and which he hoped to manifest in the Kelmscott Press books. As well as that, in terms of proportion and spacing, Morris was absolutely insistent that words and letters should not be cramped. They should be spaced, given enough space to breathe on the page. And as you can see, this is exemplified in this book here. There are no, in Morris's words, unsightly rivers of white space sort of spilling down the page, which he felt was an absolute aberration and distracted the eye from the the content of the text. Morris, of course, also insisted on good quality paper. And if any of you, you know, are fortunate enough to have come into contact with pre 1500 books, you will know that they're extraordinary in terms of the quality of the paper and the way they, you know, they've lasted, and you know, absolute, you know, there could have been, you know, some of these books you hold them in your hands and you think, you know, they really could have been printed yesterday. They're absolutely extraordinary, and certainly put modern paperbacks to shame. We'll come back a little bit and speak a bit more about Morris's search for the perfect paper as we go along, but yeah, just something to bear in mind. So yeah, so we've got the margin spacing, we've got nicely spaced letters, there's no rivers. Example on this slide, and I've got a close up here. You can also see that there's a guide letter. So as many of you will be aware, late 1400s, early 1500s, well, 1450s, 60s, and then the decades, the sort of few decades following that. Excuse me, you've got a bit of a crossover where the influence of medieval manuscripts is still felt, and in this respect, many purchasers and users of early printed books like to have hand drawn initial letters in their books, and so the early printers handily put these little guide letters in, which someone could come along afterwards and draw a nice sort of elaborate initial letter, probably in red. But as you can see, in this instance, it hasn't. It's neglected to have happened. So one or two more books before we get to the Kelmscott Press to continue. I make no apology for sort of spending a bit of time on this, because I think it really helps to give you that contextual sort of background, and then when you see the Kelmscott Press books, you know, you can sort of go, but yeah, it's useful. So the next book here then we've got is Johannes Herald's Sermon de Tempore et de Sanctis. Apologies for my abysmal Latin pronunciation. But this was printed in Nuremberg by Anton Koberger in 1494. Again, as you saw, we've got a modern binding on it. But again, similar, you know, similar principles, which Morris would later adhere to, which he felt to be those necessary for the perfectly proportioned page, double page unit. You've got the those proportioned margins, which I mentioned before. There's a difference with this book, of course. You'll notice that rather than Roman lettering, this is in a Gothic or black letter text. The text is in double columns, as you can see, and we've also got quite nicely an example on the left hand side. You can see one of those hand drawn in red initials, rubricated initials around the guide letter there as well. Also, which is quite nice, on the left hand side in that margin, you can see some annotations in presumably an early modern. Well, it is you can see that there's some. It's an early modern hand. So some annotations there, which is quite nice to sort of give you a little bit of a sense of the manner in which early modern readers interacted with their books. Very much saw the book as something to engage with, and you know, writing in books at that point certainly not frowned upon in the way that it became and perhaps still is in the minds of some. I shall mention at this point, if you want to learn more about the early modern books, early printed books, I should say, that we hold in the Norfolk Heritage Centre, please do check out the Unlocking the Archive project. We've been fortunate enough over the past 4 or 5 years or so in working with a couple of really wonderful academics at the University of East Anglia on this project, Unlocking the Archive, and they've been coming in and researching and helpfully passing on their knowledge about some of our early printed books. So if you Google Unlocking the Archive, you can learn more about that. And they've, in the last year or so, also created a pretty special online resource called Discover Historic Books. I'm sure Rachel, again, will put that in the chat or email that to you after the session. But yeah, it's a really good sort of online resource and gives you a lot more information and some really nice sort of in-depth close-up photographs of some of our incunabula. Okay, so we just got a couple more. This one is the Practica. So it's a medical book by a chap called Antonius Guanerius, again printed in 1497 in Venice, again a modern binding. This one donated, as you can see, by the autograph on the flyleaf by John Kirkpatrick. Kirkpatrick was a really, really important figure for the Norwich City Library, in as much as he was an antiquarian of the 18th century and really, really interested, obviously, in discovering more about the history of the city and the county, and was clearly interested in the development of early modern printing, if his collection of incunabula is anything to go by. He died in 1728, and under the terms of his will, donated 200 volumes to the City Library, many of which were pre-1501 works. But again, you can see we've got, again, similar proportions, the margins, black letter again, Gothic font, but also we've got these nice little printed initial letters, decorative initial letters, which no hand-drawn ones in this one. Although we do actually have, as you can see on the bottom right-hand side, we've got a bit of marginalia, some annotations in the bottom right and top left and top right as well, as we can see. Also on this book, as well as these delightful little woodcut initial letters, which you will see resemble those which Morris was to include in the Kelmscott Press books. Also, we've got the inclusion of a printer's mark. Those of you who have studied early printed books will know that although they didn't appear incredibly often in the really early days of printing, by the 1470s, 1480s onwards, printers' marks were becoming more established and were appearing in more books. Essentially, they're trademarks for printers, but they can be wonderfully, really interesting examples of early graphic design. And they can involve puns. So, there was for example, there's a Scottish printer, famous Scottish printer called Andrew Miller, and his printer's mark was a windmill. Not incredibly clever, that one, but there are some really nice sort of verbal and visual puns that manifested within many printers' marks. This one is the printer's mark of Tavanio Scotto, who was the printer of this particular book. Again, a Venetian printer, died around about 1500, but he had this printer's mark, as you can see, which is sort of an orb and cross sort of design, with the orb divided into the two hemispheres, with the initials, the OS, and the lower half of the orb with the M, which signifies his city of origin, which was Monza. So the printer's mark, again, something which Morris took on and included in his Kelmscott Press books. And I've just got one more before we get into those. So this is, as many of you will know, the Nuremberg Chronicle, or Liber Chronicarum, by Hartmann Schedel. This is in more of an original bind. The boards are certainly older than those of the previous books that you've just seen. Clearly, it's been rebacked in relatively modern times as well, but the boards are pretty old. I don't know if they're absolutely contemporary, but they're pretty. They're obviously much older than the modern bindings seen in the previous books. But I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the Nuremberg Chronicle. Absolute, one of the most famous of early printed books. Astonishing achievement. It was printed, as I say, by Anton Koberger, one of the key printers which Morris held in particular esteem. Printed in 1493. It's generally known as the Nuremberg Chronicle, and it's widely regarded as one of the most important, and is certainly the most extensively illustrated book of the 14th century. The text, as you can see, is illustrated with these marvelous woodcuts. It's in Latin, as were all of the previous books that I've just shown you. The book itself, the text, is basically a universal sort of history of the world, going right back to the origins, the Christian origin of the world in the view of the Christian religion, going up to roughly when the book was published, about sort of 1500. But as I say, the book, from a modern perspective, really sort of knocks you off your feet in terms of its illustrations. It was thought for many years that Dürer was one of the artisans that was involved in the creation of the woodcuts. This is apparently since been disproved, but nonetheless, as you can see, just as through this example of this, and quite now, what's obviously a couple of chaps on opposite sides of a riverbank appear to be catching some kind of beast in the river there, but really, really exciting, visually arresting, and also thoughtfully and imaginatively designed and considered. We mentioned at the beginning that Morris was concerned to have the double page spread as the unit of the book, the perfect unit of the book, and to design his books with that in mind, and to appropriately marry text and illustration, and to have the right sizes of type and the right kind of type to match illustrations, and not have things too heavily printed, and have everything nicely spaced and apportioned and what have you. And this is certainly exemplified in the case of the Nuremberg Chronicle. This double page spread here, you can see obviously we've got the Noah's Ark, the building of the Ark, on the right hand side at the top there, and we've got a close up of that there. Morris actually did own a copy, I believe, of this of the Nuremberg Chronicle, and this particular edition, not this particular copy, I hasten to add, but this edition, this Latin text. There were copies of the Nuremberg Chronicle printed in the German, in the vernacular, in German. They were printed at the same time as the Latin edition. But Morris Morris owned a copy of the first Latin text, which was, as this one is, as you can see, printed in July 1493. Interestingly, apparently, the copy that Morris owned, he gave away as a wedding present in 1874 to William, Michael, and Lucy Rossetti. Apparently, he bought another copy afterwards to replace the one he gave away as a wedding present. But yeah, not a bad wedding present, is it? Certainly, yeah, beats a tease made or whatever. Okay, here we can see the colophon. So the colophon, giving details of the book's publication and production, details of printing, where it was printed, when it was printed, who the printer was, and all that sort of thing. And again, this is something that Morris took from early printed books, as indeed did, the majority of the private presses which followed in Kelmscott Press's wake and were influenced by William Morris. Yeah, okay, so we're going to move on now and actually look. Hurrah! I hear you cry. Actually, look at some some Kelmscott Press books. We've got quite a few to zip through. As I say, we're going to go through fairly chronologically, but I'll sort of nip back and forward at one or two points just to sort of be able to bring out and compare and contrast one or two things, and to bring out a couple of points that I'd like to make. But this is the first book which came from the Kelmscott Press. So I referred earlier on to the spur, the real spur for Morris to set up Kelmscott, being the 1888, November the 15th, 1888, Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society lecture given by Emery Walker. Apparently he left that lecture absolutely, fired up, and he said to Walker, "Let's design our own font of type." That is recorded as being his stated wish. And so it's worth bearing that in mind when we look at the books that follow, that Morris really was, his primary enthusiasm and primary aim was to design his own type, which took the best aspects of those of the early printers in the 1400s and early 1500s. And to that end, he created the press really as a vehicle for the type. Of course, as the notes on his aims and founding the Kelmscott Press said, he had distinct and very firmly held beliefs in terms of the perfect book. But I think it's important to sort of bear that in mind. The type was what really captured his imagination. So what we have here is the story of the glittering plane. This is a small quarto. It was issued in May the 8th, 1891. And as I say, it was the first book to appear from the Kelmscott Press. So he moved pretty swiftly, as with every endeavour, commercial, artistic, political, every endeavour that Morris sort of attempted. You know, he didn't hang about. He threw himself into it, and really, you know, did become really skilled in every aspect, or at least knowledgeable in every aspect of book production. Although, as I say, he had Emery Walker as a partner to advise him. Emery Walker was asked by Morris to become an official partner in the Kelmscott Press, but being quite of a sort of a modest and retiring disposition, he declined to take up that position of official partner. But effectively, in all but name, he was a partner in terms of his advice, in terms of the nuts and bolts and the artistic side of the typography and the printing. But the story of the glittering plane, as you can see, it's bound in vellum, as the majority of the Kelmscott Press books were, and it had these wash leather ties as well. It was the only book produced by the press to have the wash leather ties. All of the other vellum bound books have silk ties in various colours, including yellow and blue and green, most of which, unfortunately, obviously due to the passing of time, have faded over the years. But one or two of them in our collection are still fairly vibrant, which is quite nice to see. But yeah, so the book was an instant success. There is the sort of title page, or the initial first page, with this wonderful, huge, well, relatively large. They get bigger as you'll see, but the initial letter, this initial I here, really beautifully designed with this border. This was in an edition of 200. As I say, came out in May, and the entire production of 200 was sold out by July. And this is the first of a handful of books which I want to show you, which are smaller books, which Morris basically, as I say, Morris was enthused, was fired with the idea of designing his own type, his own brand of type, and his vision was to produce a type which would be used to produce a version of the Golden Legend, a really famous and hugely popular book in the medieval and into the early modern period, which was basically a collection of Catholic saints' lives. And we'll see a copy of the Kelmscott version momentarily. But yeah, so basically he wanted to design this type, which was a Roman type, and he called it golden, the golden type, intending it to be used to be produced for a version of the Golden Legend. Unfortunately, technicalities in terms of a bit of a sort of a cock up, I suppose is the word I'm looking for, in terms of the paper sizing that he ordered or that was manufactured for his first batch of paper, meant that the paper wasn't the correct size for printing the sort of folio, the larger book that he intended the Golden Legend to be. So in the meantime, the Kelmscott produced a number of smaller books before the Golden Legend could be produced. So this is the first book from the press and the first of those smaller books. The Glittering Plane, the text itself, is Morris's own work. The Kelmscott Press books fall into a number of categories. The largest of which, I believe, is works that were actually written by William Morris, and this is one of those. This story first appeared, The Glittering Plane, in the English Illustrated magazine, but it's basically a fantasy novel, fundamentally. So we'll go on, and I'll just sort of run through run through the books. We've got here the Songs of Proteus by W.S. William Scorn Blunt. Sorry, Wilfrid, not William, Wilfrid Blunt. And you can see the spine there with the silk, nice yellow, as I say, some of them are still fairly vibrant. We've got silk yellow ties of this one there, again bound in vellum. And I include this one particularly, well, it's interesting from a biographical perspective. I don't want to get too much into sort of gossip and that sort of thing in terms of Morris's life, but as many of you will know, he didn't have a hugely happy married life in some respects. His wife was well known to have had an affair with Rossetti, the pre-Raphaelite artist and poet, and also had an affair with the author of this book, Wilfrid Blunt, who by all accounts was rather something of the rake. But yeah, that's an added bit of interest in terms of this book. Rather generous and big-hearted of Morris to publish his work. I think you'll agree. But aside from that, it's of interest for this red initial letter. It was the only book in which the initials were printed in red. So as we go through, you'll see more and more wonderful examples of these borders and beautifully elaborate woodcut initials. But this is the only example where the initial letters were red. And apparently this was at Blunt's sort of insistence, but Morris apparently didn't think the effect worked all that well. Whether or not this was influenced by the author's relationship with his wife or not, who knows? But actually, I think, you know, as we go through, you'll probably see that as in most things artistic, Morris was perfectly correct. So yeah, we'll talk about materials in terms of ink, because there we go. That we've got the Kelmscott Press. This is the colophon and the dedication, which I believe is to Morris's wife, rather shamelessly there. But we've got the Kelmscott Press mark, the first Kelmscott Press mark, printer's mark with the colophon there, as I say, you know, sort of taking on that from the early printers. So yeah, so I'll just sorry, bear with me just a moment. We'll just go back. Yeah, so the Songs of Proteus by William Blunt, collection of poems. As I say, the only book with the initials printed in red. Just to talk a little bit about ink and materials. One of the things that Morris talks about in his notes on and aims in founding the Kelmscott Press, as well as the proportions and the you know, the insistence on having correct spacing and good printing quality and typography and all that sort of thing. Morris is insistent that you should have the best materials in terms of producing a book, and that is certainly something that he strove for with regard to Kelmscott. We'll talk about paper a few slides along, but just to talk about the ink, because as I say, this was the only book rather that was printed with the red initials. Most of the other books were printed in black and red, but not for the initials. And some of them, including this next one, Love Is Enough, were also printed in blue, well, with some, sorry, we'll go back to that in a moment, with some blue in them as well, in 3 colors. This is one of only 2 books that were published by the Kelmscott Press in 3 colors, and included this this wonderful blue, which, as you can see, is really effective. This book, Love Is Enough, was actually, I'll go back. There we go. Also yellow silk ties there, bound in vellum. Love Is Enough was I'm sort of zooming forward a little bit chronologically, because, as I say, I just want to talk a little bit about the quest for the perfect ink. But Love Is Enough was published posthumously, and included this marvelous illustration, this beautiful woodcut illustration designed by Sir Edward Burne-Jones. Burne-Jones is probably the name that most people associate after William Morris with Kelmscott, largely probably due to the huge number of woodcuts he contributed to the to the Kelmscott Chaucer. But Burne-Jones did contribute woodcuts to quite a few of the other Kelmscott Press books. And in terms of being a very close, Morris's closest friend, they were lifelong friends, went to Oxford University together, considered joining the church, both abandoned that when their artistic inclinations became clear. But he was Morris's lifelong friend, and as you can see, absolutely beautiful, beautiful woodcut illustration here. But in terms more generally, I'm talking about this quest for the perfect ink. Basically, Morris was set upon having a really, really black ink that was made according to what he felt to be the traditional methods. So no sort of adulterating sort of modern chemicals and what have you. He wanted a top quality, really thick, sticky black ink that would last and would have this really velvety blackness that would last hundreds of years, as he saw that the early incunabula, the works of the printers of Venice and Germany and what have you in the early days of printing, what they managed to achieve. And as you can see through this illustration, this fantastic border design, this wonderful foliage, interleaved foliage, that was achieved. The ink that he eventually found, having approached a number of ink manufacturers, was a chap, was a company rather that he founded Hanover in Germany. So it was a truly black, additive-free black ink made by a chap called Gebrüder Janek in Hanover, Germany. So apparently he approached sort of commercial, commercial ink producers in England and in America, I believe, and they basically said, well, this is our blackest ink, and you can take it or leave it, and he wasn't impressed with that, and as I say, found this producer in Germany that had the necessary ink for the Kelmscott Press. So as we go through the beautiful close-up there of that blue initial in the Love Is Enough edition. Okay, so we're going to skip. I'll just leave it on that one for a moment or two. It is. They are lovely out there. Wonderful. I'm just going to briefly show you this book here. This is another one of those smaller books which were initially produced in the sort of first year or so of the press's existence before getting to the Golden Legend. And this is the Defence of Guinevere, and this was an edition of Morris's first published book. So Morris first published the Defence of Guinevere in 1858, and it was his first appearance in print, a book appearance as a poet. So it's a collection of his poetry. Again, it's a small quarto, again in the golden type, in black and red. This one, 300 paper copies at 2 guineas, 10 on vellum at about 12 guineas, and this one issued in May 1892. In terms of the physical appearance of this one, again, you can see we've got the silk ties there in a sort of a blue or green. I'm not quite sure which whether they're blue or green, but they're faded quite a bit over time. But as you can see, the spine title has been hand drawn on. This was the only Kelmscott book that had this handwritten spine title. So that's quite a nice thing to behold. And there we go. That's the title, the opening spread of the Defence of Guinevere. I'm going to zip through because I'm conscious I've got about half an hour left and I've got quite a lot to show you. So I apologise if I sort of zip through these a little bit. But as I say, I do hope at some stage we'll be able to do an event like this where we get people in to have a look at quite a few of these books in the flesh, as it were. But I should say that if any of you find yourselves or plan to be in Norwich at any point, we are actually open now for bookable sessions. You can drop us a line by email or give us a ring at the Millennium Library, and you can book a 2-hour slot So yeah, in theory, you know, certainly in theory, if you wanted to see any of these books, you know, they are publicly available and able for you to come and look at. So this one here, again, another one of these smaller works, John Ball, A Dream of John Ball. This is a novel, one of Morris's novel. It was written in 1888. The Kelmscott edition was issued in September 1892, and I really wanted to include this one. Again, we've got the silk ties in red, as you can see, in bound in vellum. But I really wanted to include this one. One, because it's one of the books in which Morris's socialism and, you know, fiery, heartfelt, and, you know, fastidiously adhered to socialist convictions are prominent. This is a novel that was inspired basically by the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and Morris wrote this novel as a sort of a reflection on that. And as you can see, it includes this marvelous woodcut opening illustration with the words, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman," which has been quoted by many a British left-wing politician in the years since. But also, I wanted to include this. It's a really nice little book. This one, actually, really, there's something very pleasing about its proportions. But this is the first appearance of an illustration by Edward Burne-Jones. So we saw a few slides ago that beautiful illustration at the opening to Love Is Enough, which was published posthumously, of course, after Morris's death in 1896, and that was an Edward Burne-Jones design woodcut. But this is the first time that one of his illustrations, one of his designs, appeared in the Kelmscott Press book. So this was in September 1892. We'll just leaf through that slightly. I hope as we go through, you know, you're getting a little bit of an idea of the difference in terms of the characteristics and the appearance of these books. Clearly, they share an aesthetic. But you know, it's sometimes said, you know, and you read it, you know, this idea is often sort of put forward that, you know, Kelmscott Press books, you know, once you've seen one, you've seen them all, kind of thing. And clearly they share this aesthetic. But that's not the case. You know, if you're fortunate enough, which I am, and I'm very, you know, something I'm very conscious of, how fortunate I am to be able to pick these books up and look at them. You do become aware that there are significant differences, and the smallest, some of them are very small. I'm going to show you a very small one momentarily as we go along, but some of them are huge. But even, you know, even they have these similar style in terms of the woodcuts and the ornament decorations and the borders and what have you. The difference in sizes and the subtle differences in terms of the design really do give them, you know, distinct individual characters. So that's something I really hope does come through, and I think, you know, comes through in relation to the John Ball. But at last, here we go. Here's the Golden Legend. So as I said earlier on, Morris designed his golden type, which was modelled on a Roman type designed by Nicholas Jensen in the late 1400s, and it was the spur to the creation of the Kelmscott Press. And as I said, he envisaged it as being used for an edition of the Golden Legend. As I say, wasn't able to print it for a little while due to the discrepancy or the error in terms of the paper that he ordered, and printed a number of those smaller works which we've just looked at. But finally, what date was it? It was November the 3rd, 1892. The Golden Legend was issued, and you can see here it's in it's in 3 volumes, isn't it? It is 3, yeah, 3 volumes. We've got the first volume here, and as you can see, it was issued in this sort of half Holland with paper labels binding. So it wasn't in a vellum binding like many of the Kelmscott Press, Kelmscott Press books and all of those that we've seen so far. It was in this half Holland sort of paper binding, and as you can see, included this stern warning from the hand of William Morris himself. If this book be bound, the edges of the leaves should only be trimmed, slightly Trumpesque capitals there, trimmed, not cut. In no case should the book be pressed, as that would destroy the impression of the type and thus injure the appearance of the printing. So we get a sense of just how much Morris personally invested in making sure that his books were treated as they ought to be by subsequent owners. There's the opening spread of the Golden Legend, and as you can see, perfectly legible, but despite what Morris articulates in his notes and aims in terms of not wanting to dazzle the eye with content, I'm sure you'll agree there's more than a little dazzling going on with the opening to this one. This is a much bigger book. I'm sorry, it's difficult to get too much of a sense of the scale with these photographs, but this is a larger book, and as I say, in 3 volumes. And when you open this one and many of the other larger sort of folio works, you do get that sense of almost being knocked over your feet when you open them up and you see all this wonderful decoration and these borders, and as I say, that beautiful velvety black richness of the ink. The Golden Legend, as I mentioned earlier, was a work which, and there we go, it had two I believe, 2 woodcuts which were designed by Burne-Jones, and this is one of them here. But yeah, it was a very popular work through the Middle Ages, the Golden Legend, collection of saints' lives, Catholic saints' lives, effectively. But William Caxton printed a version, or translated a version, printed an edition, and this is the edition which Morris follows, and it's one of a number of works. I sort of said in passing a little earlier that the Kelmscott Press books fall into a number of categories, and works which were sort of translated or printed by Caxton is one of those. A handful of works, I can't remember precisely how many, but a handful of Caxton works were printed by Kelmscott. Besides Morris's examples of Morris's own publications, including, as we've seen, the Defence of Guivere and the Story of the Glittering Plain, and others enough. Also, some works by then contemporary poets, English poets, or relatively contemporary, so works by Keats, Shelley, Swinburne, Rossetti, Tennyson as well. That sort of forms another subcategory. And then also Morris sort of also published through Kelmscott a number of works which were kind of like personal sort of touchstone books for him personally. Obviously, he was a book collector and goes without saying a hugely voracious reader, and he published a number of books through Kelmscott which were particularly important to him. So things like Sidonia, the Sorceress, which is sort of a tale of a, I think it's, I'm not actually, I'm not going to talk about that one because I don't know too much. But yeah, sort of some of the Viking, Icelandic sagas and tales and medieval tales and that kind of thing. So yeah, right, okay, let's move on. So this is still the Golden Legend, and as you can see, you're starting to really get a sense of that influence of those early printed books that I started the session with. You know, you're really getting that echo, aren't you, in relation to those beautiful woodcut, historiated, not historiated, are they, but they're decorated initial letters. And again, those sort of Morris margins in terms of the proportions. Right, okay, so now we're going to come on and spend a few slides looking at let me get the title of this right, the recuel of the histories of Troy, which again is another William Caxton translation. Again, as you can see, bound in vellum. This one was in 2 volumes, and again was a larger book. It was a quarto, but it was a large quarto, and we've got the opening sort of spread there. Similarly, sort of dazzling effect as the Golden Legend, but the Troy, of course, is notable for its giving the name to the second of the 2 types that Morris designed. Okay, so I said earlier, well, I've sort of laboured the point a little bit, but you know, Morris very much was interested in designing his own type, and that almost, the Kelmscott Press became the necessary sort of secondary step in order to fulfil that ambition. But the first type that he designed, as we've said, was the golden type to be used in the Golden Legend, which was a Roman type, a Roman letter. But the second type that Morris designed was a Gothic type, or a sort of semi-Gothic or black letter type, and it was the Troy type, and it made, of course, as you'll have worked out, its first appearance in the recueil of the history of Troy, and you can see the distinct difference in terms of the appearance of the letter. He wrote, what did he write? Though the Gothic letter persists in looking strange to modern eyes. Sorry, I'm quoting from a book which I heartily recommend, which I found in the stack, called William Morris and the Art of the Book. And I've neglected to put who it's by. I apologise for that, but I'll just read this briefly. Though the Gothic letter persists in looking strange to modern eyes, Morris's Troy type was a great achievement and his most important contribution to letter design. It was a natural outgrowth of his instinctive taste. To say the truth, he wrote, I prefer it to the Roman. So yeah, so basically the Troy type was a sort of a semi-Gothic black letter type, and Morris wrote explicitly that he intended it to redeem the Gothic type from the charge of unreadability. And as you can see, it's a pretty, you know, it's a pretty readable type, largely due, you know, to those other things as well. You know, the words and the letters are nicely spaced, and there's no cramped sort of effect, and no rivers of white space, and all of those other things which we mentioned at the outset. Beautiful, beautiful sort of corner, sort of decorative ornament there, sort of vine leaves and bunches of grapes, as you can see, as well as the initial letter. All of these, I should say, designed by Morris. Burne-Jones contributed a number of illustrations, as we've said, and he had a number. He had the hugely. Oh, excuse me, clicked on the wrong thing there. Ooh, bear with me a moment. So yeah, so he had the was fortunate enough to have the unwavering support and advice of Emery Walker, and he had a number of crafts people and artisans, sort of in terms of the wood graving, to assist in producing the designs of Burne-Jones, you know, effectively translating that into woodcut. People like Guivere and Hooper and others. But in terms of the initial letters, in terms of the overall design, and in terms of these marvelous borders and decorations, Morris entirely, you know, designed them himself. And I include here a couple of examples of, I mentioned ephemera, didn't I, at the start? And we've got some examples of Kelmscott Press ephemera here, which I wanted to include. On the left, we've got a prospectus, if you like, of forthcoming Kelmscott Press works. You can see following books will be ready shortly: The Wood Beyond the World, the poems of Percy Bysshe Shelley, Beowulf. But at the top there, on the left-hand side, you've got those examples of the different types. Excuse me, as I say, the Troy type was a larger Gothic type, And originally Morris wanted the Troy to be used in the Chaucer, which we'll sort of come on to in a moment or two, being in the press for a long period, a number of years, whilst all of these other books, as you can see by the ephemera there, many books were constantly on the go, and in many ways, that's another thing I kind of want to emphasize, they try and convey an impression of just what an organic and constantly dynamic conception the Kelmscott Press was. But as you can see, the top left, we've got, this is the golden type, this is the Troy type, and this is the Chaucer type. So basically, similarly in a way to the Golden Legend, there were lots of production problems with trying to achieve the huge undertaking that the Kelmscott Chaucer was, which eventually appeared, I believe, in 1895. I think 1895. But yeah, it took quite a few years, and they realised in the middle of trying to work on the Chaucer that the Troy type would be far too large for it, and so basically Morris created a smaller version of Troy, which he named, as you can see, the Chaucer type. So there are three types associated with the Kelmscott Press: Golden type, which was a Roman; Troy type, Gothic; and the Chaucer, which was it's the same type basically. So effectively, there are only two distinct types produced, designed by Morris. Okay, I'm just going to go through. We've got 15 minutes left. We've got a few more to go. I just want to sort of whip through some more examples, as I say, just to try and show you as much as possible. This is Reynard the Fox, another Caxton translation. I think it was certainly printed. Yeah, an edition of Reynard the Fox, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, was a sort of a medieval cycle of fables, sort of a pastiche of sort of courtly love stories of the medieval period. But Reynard the Fox, again, another particularly, personally, sort of a favourite of those that we have. It's a nice book to hold in the hand. It's a large quarto. It's got these blue silk ties, as you can see. Again, beautiful opening with this magnificent border design. Yeah, it's particularly nice, this one. It's not overly large. It's not overly thick. Some of them are fairly sort of quite sort of slab-like tomes. But yeah, the Reynard the Fox is a nice one. It's got these beautiful Morris designed ornaments and borders. We saw, I'll just sort of go through, there we go, in a close-up of one of the borders there. We're going to see momentarily the second of the two Kelmscott Press marks, or printers marks, which Morris designed. But first of all, I want to show you again the first one, so that you've got that in your mind's eye to compare it with in a moment or two. So again, this is just a close-up of the original Kelmscott Press printer's mark, with the colophon. You can see there. Here ends History of Reynard the Fox, translated into the English out of the Dutch by William Caxton, now reprinted, etc., etc. Okay. This is news from nowhere, and I wanted to include this because we're going to talk briefly about paper. We already mentioned that Morris was absolutely insistent on sourcing the top quality, the best quality materials for the publication of the books. We've mentioned the ink, and of course paper was another concern. And the manufacturer he eventually found that suited his purpose was Batchelor's. Joseph Batchelor, who was a hand paper maker of Kent, of Little Chart in Kent. Morris basically, along with Walker, went down to Kent and to Joseph Batchelor's paper mill, apparently an Italian paper of about 1473 from one of the books in his collection in his hand, and basically said to Joseph Batchelor, "Can you make me something approximate to this?" Again, as I say, Morris was, although he wasn't absolutely insistent on maintaining all of the sort of pre-industrial production methods in the production of Kelmscott Press books. For example, in terms of the type design, he was quite happy for Emery Walker to blow up photographically examples of Jensen and other early printers' type, and to use these to design his own type, and to have them photographically reduced and that kind of thing. In terms of materials, you know, he was certainly you know, a traditionalist and wanted handmade, mold-made paper. You can see the chain lines and the quite you know, not overly narrow wire lines on this mold-made paper. But you can also, in this slide, which is from News from Nowhere, see, I hope, it's not easy to see, but I hope you can just about make out in the center of the image the watermark, because Morris, as I say, directed Batchelor to make, you know, a really nice, thick paper that would be flexible but tough, and, you know, comparable to the brilliant quality paper that the early printers used. And Batchelor eventually, you know, came up with the goods, and he delivered to Morris over the life of the Kelmscott Press 3 different batches of paper with different watermarks. And there was primrose or flower watermarked paper, which was a design that the mark itself was Morris's design, of course. And you can see that on this particular slide. If you turn your head and look in the center, you've got the sort of three flowers emerging from leaves, and stem with the W and M on either side. And there, I hope you can make that out. And then just to compare, we've got another page. This is perhaps a little harder. If you sort of angle your head a little bit, or angle the screen if you're able to, but on the left-hand side, just over halfway up, sort of on the far left of your screen, you should just about, I hope, be able to make out another watermark, and that was a second of the 3 watermarks that were created, which was a little apple, very simple little watermark of an apple with 2 leaves sprouting from it. The third, agonizingly, I haven't been able to locate, excuse me, in our books at the Heritage Centre. I'm sure it lurks there somewhere, but as yet I've been unable to find an example. But it's apparently a fish, a perch watermark design with a sprig in its mouth. So that's something we need to try and look for. But again, another beautiful woodcut at the opening here to News from Nowhere. And this is Kelmscott Manor. So Kelmscott Press was named after Morris's country abode, Kelmscott Manor, and this is a design after the house. News from Nowhere also really important, I think, to include, because similarly to a Dream of John Ball, but more so in its influence, it attests to the importance of Morris's politics. It's a utopian fiction. It's effectively a novel, and as I'm sure many of you will know, it is almost unarguably Morris's sort of most influential work nowadays. News from Nowhere has been incredibly influential. It's still in print as a classic, as an Oxford classic, I believe, and it's been massively influential since it was published. It was originally published. The Kelmscott edition was issued in 1892, but News from Nowhere was originally published in 1890, and was translated in many languages and was read in pre-revolutionary Russia and across Europe, and you know, has been particularly influential for left-wing politicians and activists and intellectuals in Britain. You know, people like Tony Benn, Michael Foot, and Barbara Castle, and what have you, have been well, have gone on record to say how influential in their early, as an early influence, Morris's News from Nowhere was. This is just leafing through the text. How are we doing? We're almost there. We're almost there. Beautiful close up there of one of the initial letters. If you look closely at the initial letters, you really do get a sense of that really rich, beautiful, velvety rich blackness of the ink that was used. I'm just going to. This is Godfrey of Boulogne. This is another Caxton history of Godfrey of Boulogne and of the conquest of Jerusalem, reprinted from Caxton's edition of 1481. This is one of the bigger books, and it's one of the sort of most gorgeous. Everything comes together. There's lots of ornaments which Morris particularly designed, which only, I believe, oh, bear with me, where does it say? Oh yes, it includes the new, that's right, it includes the second press mark, which you'll see in a moment. So I'll just sort of leaf through this one just to give you a sense of the extent of the ornamentation. Again, as I say, this is one of the larger books, a large quarto, quite chunky volume, but with these marvelous ornaments and border decorations, and of course the initial letters printed in the Troy type, as you will see. As you can see, these lovely, nice little paragraph sort of spacing marks, these little leaves on the right hand side. They're lovely. Printed in black and red. I'll just go through, and there's the second Kelmscott printer's mark there. In my opinion, not as nice as the first one, but it's a purely subjective opinion, but still pretty striking. I think you'll agree. We're coming towards the end, but I did just want to include this as an example of one of the very, very much smaller books that Morris produced through Kelmscott. This is a sextodecimo. This is one of a number of really, it's almost a miniature. It's not quite a miniature book, but it does fit in the palm of the hand very nicely. And as I say, I just wanted to include this to sort of add to that effort to try and convey an impression of just how distinct some of the books, well, all of the books were in their various and different ways. Very much smaller work. It was translated out of it was a French tale, which was done out of the ancient French by William Morris. And as you can see, I think you can get a sense of that, how distinct the differences are. Much smaller, but in a way only sort of heightens the effect of the initials, the tiny little initial woodcut letters, but really lovely on the smaller scale. There we go. So I'm just going to finally end up with what would have been if we had an original copy. Well, it is the Kelmscott Chaucer is, of course, the crowning achievement, is widely seen as the crowning achievement of the press. But unfortunately, as I've already mentioned, we don't have a copy, so we have to make do in our store with this facsimile, which is, I have to say, a pretty poor substitute, I'm afraid. But it does, at least with this title spread, give you a little bit of a sense of the effect it must have. The Chaucer was memorably described by Burne-Jones as being in conception and effect akin, or what they aimed for, Morris and Burne-Jones in conceiving and producing the Kelmscott Chaucer, was the idea of producing a pocket cathedral, which when you consider that Burne-Jones contributed 87 87 illustrations to, as well as this multitude of incredible, ornament and border and decorative work by Morris. I'm sure you'll agree was achieved. So I'm just going to finish on just to sort of add to that idea of the way in which the Kelmscott Press was a incredible almost akin to one of the sort of flourishing organic borders that Morris designed. It sort of had all of these works always on the go at the same time. We've got another example of the ephemera there, and an order form, which gives you a sense of the way in which Kelmscott operated as a business. You've got, to the secretary of the Kelmscott Press, please send me when ready a copy of Beowulf. So we mustn't forget that Morris was a canny businessman, as well as an artist of extraordinary ambition and ability. And there is the last page of the last book that was produced, and we pretty much opened with this, didn't we? That was the notes on the aims and founding of the Kelmscott Press, in which Morris outlined his aims and his ambitions in terms of the founding of the press. But as you can see, we've got the colophon there. This was the last book printed at the Kelmscott Press. It was finished Hammersmith on the 4th day of March, sold by the trustees of the late William Morris at the Kelmscott Press. And clearly, once Morris had died in 1896, there was no way, although a number of books were produced posthumously, these were all books such as Love Is Enough and this one that had been sort of considered, that had been planned out already in Morris's lifetime. And Walker, understood, as did everyone involved, all the other people involved in the press, that there could not be a Kelmscott Press without William Morris at the helm. And I suppose before we end, I'm not giving you much time. I'm slightly overrunning, but it's just worth taking a moment to consider how extraordinarily influential William Morris was. As I sort of alluded to earlier, a number of private presses flourished in the 1890s and early 1900s and into the 20th century, absolutely stamped in terms of influence by Kelmscott. Dove's Press, Ashendene Press, Essex House, later on the Golden Cockerel Press, to a lesser extent, but in Britain, in Europe, in America particularly, William Morris's influence on the book arts, really, it's difficult to overstate them. And that's where I'm going to leave it. I'm sorry I've slightly overrun, and apologies that I've not given you much time to sort of ask any questions or what have you. If you do wish to ask any questions, please do so.